Right now, the Western media landscape is laser-focused on eye-popping Russian casualty figures, with the implication being that Russia cannot sustain these losses. And indeed, later we will see that at current rates, Russia will suffer 33,991,753 more fatalities before fully conquering Ukraine. But this is overshadowing the bigger story. Russia is running out of stuff. And that is the type of thing that can bring down governments, which, in this case, can also end wars. Now, to be clear, Russian casualties do matter. The problem is that the mechanism that gets you from a high count here to Russia looking at the situation over here and choosing to pull out is rather dicey. When it does happen, usually the way it works falls into one of three categories. Let's start with the obviously inapplicable case, that there is literally no one left to fight the war. All gone. The headlines that more Russians have died in this war than combined losses from all other wars post-World War II are intriguing. But it is more of a reflection on how few soldiers have died before this one than the brutality of the invasion of Ukraine, even if it is brutal. To summarize the main contributors, we have 18,500 in the Chechen Wars, 15,000 in Afghanistan, and 6,500 during the Shadow War in Ukraine. To put this in context, take a look at Russia's population pyramid, and make it a good look, because we will be returning to it later. Let's go with a high fatality count of 120,000 for this war. This is an estimate based on Russia's own probate registry, but keep in mind that this is war, and thus we have the fog of war, incentives to exaggerate, and all that other fun stuff. And if you wait a minute, I will do an exercise with Russia's own numbers to further clarify it. Anyway, take that 120,000 to the population pyramid, and it would occupy only this small sliver. It is pretty hard to see. In fact, the more detailed estimates put the breakdown at about 0.4% of all men in the 25 to 49 bracket, and closer to 0.3% for men 20 to 24. Remember that both sides are trying to protect the lowest range, because both have shrinking demographics, and they would really like that cohort to have children before visiting the battlefield. Baby making aside, even in the worst case for Russia, there is plenty more humanity to continue this process. Now, to be clear, Russia will have significant manpower problems at the current rate that the war is going. Since Russia took the initiative in November 2023, the amount of land taken in each month looks like this. More recently, you see a spike in May when Russia began the Kharkiv offensive, followed by much smaller gains in June, as Ukraine went on a counteroffensive up there, but still lost comparatively more ground along the Eastern Front. In any case, let's do some quick back-of-the-envelope math here. The average per-month gain over this offensive for Russia is a staggeringly low 0.012% of Ukrainian territory. So far, across all offensives, Russia has captured 17.57% of Ukraine, leaving 82.43% to go. Note that the vast majority of Russian captures came from the initial 2014 annexation of Crimea, and then the first 2 months of the 2022 invasion. But let's do the math for the more recent numbers instead. Take 82.43%, divide it by 0.012%, and you get another 6,798 more months until Russia completes the full capture of Ukraine at this pace. You might recall that a while ago, Putin seemed to accidentally divulge that right now, Russia was suffering 5,000 fatalities per month. This is close to some estimates, and much lower than others. But remember, fog of war again. So let's take 5,000 as a low bar and go with it for a minute. And just to stress this again, 5,000 is the Kremlin's own number, and the territorial exchange data is visually apparent. I know that's not going to stop the comments, but feel free to ignore them in light of this. Anyway, multiply 5,000 per month by 6,798 months, and you end up with 33,991,753 deaths. Forgive me for doing some rounding earlier. Also note that this number may be different than what the title of the video says, as I plan to update it as the months roll by. Anyway, that is where you start looking at the population pyramid, and begin to believe that sustaining those rates is not physically possible. Of course, that assumes that Russia will try to take literally every last piece of Ukrainian territory. It also assumes that the rate stays constant, and there are no spikes due to things like the fall of Chasiv Yar. Remember, not much happened after D-Day until everything started to happen. It further assumes that Ukraine will not run out of warm bodies well before that. Western sources are not releasing updates on that as frequently, so it is a bit of a mystery. Ukraine is smaller, but defenders usually do better regarding the casualty ratio. Or maybe you think that the first 3 months of Russia's offensive are not informative, and so we should just be averaging out the following 5, while simultaneously ignoring the fact that the more recent period has been more deadly. That ticks us up from a pace of 0.012% to 0.017%. Back to the math. We've managed to lower the time to just 4,792 months. And, with a little more math, the bargain price of 23,962,209 fatalities. On the other hand, it also assumes that Ukraine will never retake the initiative, despite now ample funding from Western coalition partners. We also have not thought about casualties. In that aforementioned discussion, Putin did not give as clear of an indication on those numbers. But let's use the traditional 3-to-1 ratio. Time to get out the calculator again. Take the 33-some-odd million, multiply it by 3, and it works out to 101,975,258 wounded. Some of them may be able to return to the battlefield, while others will be permanently disabled. For comparison, it should be noted that Russia's total population is about 144 million. Oh, and there is the slight detail that 6,798 months translates to more than 566 years, which kinda throws the relevance of the whole 2024 population pyramid out the window. The point remains, though, that the binding constraints here are so far into the future that they are not important for maintaining Russian military capacity in the present. The second possibility is a revolution or coup at home. Either the new leadership enters office and then recalls the troops, or expectations of threats to the regime cause the current leader to preemptively pull out. Expecting this mechanism of war termination to happen soon with Russia requires a fundamental misunderstanding of how Russia is prosecuting the war. We might break down the soldiers fighting in Ukraine into 3 separate buckets. The first group initiated the invasion. They did not know what they were getting themselves into until they saw Putin make this announcement. Some were volunteer soldiers, others doing their routine but required military service. The second group came later. They are part of the mobilization class of 2022. They knew that the war was happening, and this was not part of an ordinary service. They woke up one day, saw Putin making this announcement, and were then told that they needed to go to Ukraine. Finally, you have the third group. Since that mobilization announcement, Russia has been relying on voluntary contracts, citizens willingly becoming soldiers in exchange for financial compensation. Of these, Group 3 is unlikely to cause a political issue. For those of us with the luxury of high-speed internet connections and the leisure time to watch videos on YouTube, the idea of taking money in exchange for a high risk of death or dismemberment seems rather insane. But that is just what poverty can do to someone with a family and few other opportunities. Moreover, the available data indicates that the bulk of deaths are coming from the center of the country, not the political centers toward the west, despite smaller populations here than here. The regional differences suggest that those who are dying are less likely to be originally signing up because of the Kremlin's political persuasion campaigns, and, in a tale as old as time, are more likely to be doing it for the money. To put some more bones on this, Moscow is now offering $22,000 as a signing bonus, which is on top of the $7,000 annual salary that a soldier makes, if he survives. For much of my audience, signing a likely death warrant for only $22,000 sounds crazy. But bear in mind that the average yearly income in Moscow is only about $15,500, and that includes people in high-wage industries. The key is that even if you are on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can walk right into a recruitment center, and they will hand you that $22,000. That leaves Groups 1 and 2 to cause domestic problems for the Kremlin. Group 1 is from so long ago, and a good portion of them were professional soldiers anyway. Yes, they did not expect to go to Ukraine, but they are not much of a political concern anymore. That leaves us with just Group 2, the conscripted soldiers. Of the tracked fatalities, only about 12% of them came from this group. Inmates and volunteers are the bigger categories, though unidentifiable soldiers comprise the largest chunk. Remember that these numbers are estimates. Again, though, these losses tend to be coming from the political periphery. All told, as such, Group 2 is far from a political problem. And if they were going to cause a sudden issue, it would have happened way back during the announcement. There were some problems, of course, but there wasn't anything major. Now, there is still room for revolution here if the Kremlin reneges on the terms of its various contracts or tacit understandings with its soldiers, like never demobilizing the conscripts, which apparently is now the plan. Something to keep an eye on. Anyway, the point is that we are still far away from an end to the war through this particular mechanism. The last possibility is the inability to raise an army. Right now, that would mean reaching the point where the Kremlin can no longer afford what the market demands for wages. Then the powers that be would have to decide whether to go back to conscription, and the threat of uprisings that comes along with it, or pull out. As a matter of basic supply and demand 101, the most willing soldiers are the ones who sign the first contracts. So, as Russia begins to need more recruits, the offers, namely wages, will have to increase as well. Hence that $22,000 offer from a minute ago. In that manner, Ukraine imposing casualties has the effect that Kyiv desires. Recruiting the first million Russian soldiers may be easy-ish, but once you are at 33,991,753 fatalities, and need to recruit soldier number 33,991,754, well, at that point, you are recruiting tech bros from St. Petersburg, who would need massive contracts to be convinced to take their talents to South Ukraine. And the finances for this are already getting to be a bit shocking. Referencing an earlier point, though, there is a stronger version of this that does not hold as much water. This is the idea that high casualty counts are signaling to would-be recruits a greater risk of deployment, which in turn will force wages to increase. Now, some of that may be happening, but this is another case where the effect is likely minimal. Again, the people who are signing up right now are disproportionately coming from Russia's periphery, which again means that they are less likely to buy into the Kremlin narratives about the mission of the war and its rosy progress, and more likely to think of this as a purely financial transaction. So most of them know what they are getting themselves into. And again, the point is that this is far from becoming a binding constraint for the Kremlin. Instead, let's get to the Kremlin's more significant problem for the time being: stuff. Or, more precisely, a lack of stuff. At the risk of simplifying a very complicated concept, inflation arises when too much money is chasing too few goods. Macroeconomics 101 tells central bankers to raise interest rates to counteract the problem. This makes borrowing more expensive and encourages people to pull money out of the economy and lock it away in banks, thereby balancing the quantity of cash and the quantity of goods. Now, this strategy has a good track record. Indeed, following the pandemic-era sanctions spike, the United States raised interest rates with relative success. Prices initially rose when everyone was stuck at home and wanted to buy home goods. But the makers of home goods were not set up for that kind of demand. Then the pandemic subsided, and people wanted to go out and do things. But the producers of things to do were also not set up for that kind of demand. The higher interest rates encouraged savings and created a bridge to where supply could catch up, hence why inflation has now cooled. Or at least we think so as of right now. As always, macroeconomics is black magic, and no one really knows with confidence what is going on. Stay at least 100 yards back from this building at all times. Moving east, the Russian central bank also tried raising interest rates during the war, but to far less success. To wit, that number has been sitting at 16% for months, and now the central bank is signaling that it will go up again, because inflation in Russia is still trending upward at 8.3%. Indeed, the consensus is that interest rates will soon jump to 18%. We'll find out when the board meets on July 26th. So, unlike most of the rest of the world, why isn't Russian inflation improving? Well, let's begin by getting a better sense of why inflation is a problem for Russia in the first place. Wars require a ton of resources that ultimately get destroyed. And right now, the Russian government is ordering as much of this stuff as it can. Someone has to produce all of that metal, though, which is taking workers who would normally be contributing to the stuff production and moving them to the bombs production. To recap, fewer goods, same amount of money, what do you get? Inflation. Well, actually, because labor is also getting more income, both from the Russian government itself and through private employment. The more precise problem here is fewer amount of goods, more money, double inflation. But to explain why the central bank's measures have not solved the problem, we need to go back to that population pyramid. If you care about why it looks this way, then good news. We have an entire video on that subject. But, in short, World War II and a post-Soviet recession. Causes aside, the important thing for today is that we have an abnormally high number of people up here and an abnormally low number down here. Even under ordinary circumstances, this is not a good place for a country to be. Working-age adults spend their best years producing lots of goods, making a bunch of money, and then hopefully saving enough to take them through retirement. So when things are humming along, you have the younger cohort producing enough stuff to satisfy everyone along the entire pyramid. Russia was struggling along that front before the war, and you can imagine what has happened since then. Diverting so much labor to the war effort, both in terms of weapon production and deployment of individuals, has made that problem so much worse. Note that this is where the deaths and disabilities do matter. Everyone who dies needs a replacement, which further strains the pyramid's awkward ratio. So those figures from earlier do matter, but not because Russia is going to run out of men anytime soon. Rather, the economy will be completely wiped out well before then. This is part of why Russia is behind the 8-ball. Another component is that, the older that you are, the less that you care about interest rates. The promise of greater monetary rewards at a later time means little to you if you, don't plan on being alive much longer. And remember, Russia has a good number of people who fit that description. Retirees tend to live on fixed incomes. They do not have much to spend month to month, but they will spend all of it. So if food prices go up, they will still buy at those prices. They just won't go golfing. But those limited resources can make the oldest cohort more vulnerable to inflation. Moreover, their unwillingness to defer spending raises deeper problems for the central bank. Indeed, at some point, we may need to have the discussion of whether Russia will ever be able to stifle inflation with higher interest rates, given that this has a side effect of suppressing investment, which also means there will be less stuff in the future. But the other layer of the problem is sanctions. If this type of supply shortage were to happen in a place with an open economy, international firms would provide a solution. If prices are going up in a particular region, firms will simply ship more of their products there. After all, it is where the most money is to be made. Now, the region in question would still see some inflation. Those firms will have to pay to ship the goods to get there. Nonetheless, the burden of higher prices would be small and distributed across the entire world, rather than large and concentrated in that one particular country. It would also have bad implications for the long-run health of the local economy, but at least inflation would not be a concern right then and there. Russia, though, is not like that. At the moment, the country is not an open economy, at least not in the traditional sense. The sanctions that the West implemented at the beginning of the war have isolated the Kremlin, and, by extension, all other Russians. That is putting immense stress on China to be Russia's chief exporter. But those consumers in Russia want to pay in rubles, and that is the rub. Rubles are not as competitive on the global market as the dollar or euros, so Chinese firms are hesitant to seek new clients there. Thus, China is mitigating the problem, but not outright solving it. There is also the problem that Chinese firms do not want to be the target of the West's secondary sanctions as punishment for doing business in Russia. So that is further compounding the Kremlin's problems. Zooming out, most of the Western media's discussions about whether sanctions are working focuses on the oil and gas trade and the military sector. Remember, Russia needs a ton of money for any of this to work, and in that light, the former is the economic engine of the war, while the latter is the backbone of the war machine. The Kremlin has done well to find solutions to keep energy exports going and the tank factories operating. But the war is only allowed to continue so long as it is politically feasible in Russia. And the sanctions to inflation pathway is on pace to test that far before the casualties matter. Meanwhile, the pathway to learn more about the war is a simple visit to the description below to get more information on my books on the subject. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.